morning. Is that working? Good morning. Happy New Year. Greetings to everyone joining us remotely by YouTube. We're excited to host you today. I'm Tim Haab, and I'm the interim director of the Ohio State School of Environment and Natural Resources. We're now in the second week of Ohio State's spring semester, although you can't really tell it's spring quite yet. Thanks for making it out on the cold weather to participate in the first of several programs that will be hosted here in this venue on what is the 8th National Day of Racial Healing. To see an outline for this morning's program, please refer to the agenda located on the brochures on your table. To minimize waste, we've printed out a couple of copies of the brochure for you. There's also a QR code on your table that you can look at. You can look at on your mobile device that has the full program on it as well. The brochure contains today's agenda as well as professional bios for two of our morning speakers. On the subject of material waste, we're proud to continue our partnership with Ohio State's Office of Student Life and Dining Services for use of their zero waste toolkits featuring the scarlet colored reusable plates, bowls, cups, and cutlery items that many of you are utilizing this morning. You can help us return these toolkits with all pieces accounted for by scraping the food off into the compost bin and returning all pieces to the utensil return bins located near the exits. We'll provide more instructions on this at the end of the event. For those currently viewing on YouTube, Molly Bean's placing a link to the program brochure in the chat. Please feel free to utilize the chat function in YouTube to post your comments, thoughts, and questions throughout the program. Our team will be fielding questions posted there and those from the in-person audience to our featured speaker, Dr. Gail Myers, around 9:15 a.m. Our program brochure also lists the individuals and organizations who chose to sponsor a student for today's EPN events. Thanks to all our sponsors who help make these programs affordable and accessible to students each month. Before I conclude my remarks, there are several individuals who deserve special recognition for their role in crafting and supporting the programs we have today. Thank you to Tia Stewart and the many members of the Regenerative Farmer Fellowship Program. Thank you for their role, who made the journey today from Dayton to be with us. Thank you to Emily Smith and the sustainability team at Intel, who also joined us as a group today. Ms. Stephanie Hightower, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Columbus Urban League, is with us today. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Ms. Hightower. We're grateful for your presence and local leadership. Kalia Tejas deserves special acknowledgement for her many roles in crafting today's events. In fact, the genesis for today's EPN program began in 2022 when Kalia was researching nationally recognized speakers to serve as a keynote to our 2023 Signature Earth Day event. That program, Art, Culture, and Advancing the Relationship of Black People on Land, was created in collaboration with Ricardo Valentine and Orlando Zane Hunter Jr., the interdisciplinary duo behind Brotherhood Dance. The EPN was seeking someone who had experience working with, documenting the experiences of, and supporting black farmers in Ohio to amplify the performances and exhibits developed by Brotherhood Dance and to address their key themes. The connection that Dr. Myers has to the state of Ohio run deep, and I know this will be addressed later today. The idea to feature her work for Earth Day 2023 struck a definite chord in our community, including with many here in the room. And the efforts are underway to welcome her into the program. After months of trying to make the schedules work, Dr. Myers was booked in too many places for too many Earth Day related talks in 2023, and the visit to Columbus last April just wasn't going to be possible. Joe and Kalia kept up the effort, and about a year ago, the plan shifted to working with Shannon Sherd and Dr. Myers' team to host her here sometime in 2024. The significance of hosting this program on the day after Martin Luther King Day is attributed to the vision and immediate support from Dr. Kathy Lechman. Dr. Lechman will soon be here at the podium to speak about the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Project and the National Day of Racial Healing. So I won't review the details now, but her initiative to work with the environmental and natural resources community, as well as those operating in the food and agricultural domain, made it much easier on the EPN to host the event we're having today. Dr. Lechman introduced Joe and Kalia to Mr. Thomas Dickens with the University Libraries at Ohio State, 'who' provided sponsorship and logistical assistance to help anchor the program. Dr. Lechman introduced Joe and Kalia to Mr. Thomas Dickens with the University Libraries at Ohio State, 'who' provided sponsorship and logistical assistance to help anchor the program. Dr. Lechman introduced Joe and Kalia to Mr. Thomas Dickens with the University Libraries at Ohio State, Thank you to Maritza Pierre, doctoral candidate in SENR, as well as Amope Carter-Debaku and Tia Stewart, who were part of planning conversations with our team this autumn in the lead up to today's program. I also want to thank Jera Oliver, PhD candidate in agricultural communications, education, and leadership, who not only joined in planning conversations, but also displayed elements of her doctoral research in the hallway earlier this morning. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look at that before you came in the room. The last partnership I'd like to acknowledge is with Jera Oliver and her colleague Adrienne Williams, who together are co-founders of the Growing and Growth Collective. Adrienne and Jera, along with Sydney Roberts-Cruz with the Black Ohio Film Group, played a major role in securing the venue for last night's film screening of Dr. Meyer's Rhythms of the Land. You can learn more about Jera's work in her professional bio, which is located in the program brochure. Moving on to today's program, this event would not be possible without the support of Dr. Kathy Lechman, our Assistant Dean and Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Ohio State's College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. In her role, Dr. Lechman works closely with the college dean and senior leadership to ensure that all college faculty and staff and students feel valued for their individual talents and unique cultural perspectives. Dr. Lechman has a Master of Arts degree in Conflict Resolution from Antioch University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology from the College of Worcester. She earned her PhD from OSU's College of Education and Human Ecology, where her dissertation focused on examining the influence of student perception of instructor cultural intelligence, sense of belonging, and intent to persist. Please, everyone, welcome up Dr. Kathy Lechman.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see so many people. For those who are viewing via YouTube, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the National Day of Racial Healing and the Truth in Healing project that kind of started the National Day of Racial Healing. So the W.K. Kellogg Foundation was created in 1930 with a very broad purpose that included administering funds for the promotion of the welfare, comfort, health, education, feeding, clothing, sheltering, and safeguarding of children and youth, directly or indirectly without regard to sex, race, creed, or nationality. They were fortunate, and a broad directive was given to, quote, use the money as you please, so long as it promotes the health, happiness, and well-being of children. Isn't that lovely? Wouldn't it be nice if we all had that directive and the resources that go with it? This mission continues today, and there are many projects funded throughout the country, including among sovereign tribes in Mexico and Haiti. There are several states that are the focal point for the Kellogg Foundation. That includes Michigan, Mississippi, New Mexico, New Orleans, and then in Chiapas and the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and central and southern and South Haiti. Ensuring that children and families have opportunities to reach their full potential is connected to social justice. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Project is a community-based process designed to bring about transformational and sustainable change to address historic and contemporary issues of racism in communities. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation model was developed in 2016 through a collective effort including 176 leaders and scholars from across the country that included a wide array of community-based organizations. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Project defines racial healing as restoring to wholeness, repairing damage, and setting right. This process includes acknowledging the wrongs of the past while addressing the consequences of those wrongs. When it comes to the work of racial healing, it is all of our responsibility as racism impacts people from all backgrounds. The National Day of Racial Healing is an offshoot of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Project, and it is a time for us to reflect on our shared values and create a blueprint for healing from the effects of racism. Racial healing brings people together to listen and dialogue about historic and systemic wrongs that have been perpetrated upon many communities. The goal of racial healing is to build trust and to restore communities and people to wholeness while challenging and rebuilding social structures. Today's topic of recognizing the historical injustices in agriculture and the importance of environmental experiences is one component of moving forward toward racial healing. And part of what we're doing, we have this today, this morning, and then this afternoon we're going to be having two sessions across the way in the International Room, one focusing on access to land and the other one focusing on cultural humility. And I think this is a great opportunity to engage in these dialogues of acknowledging the past wrong. So again, I just want to thank you all for being here and for putting forth the effort into doing this. And now it's my pleasure to call up Jera Oliver, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
All right, good morning. So I am grateful for this opportunity to bring greetings on behalf of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at The Ohio State University. I believe our interim vice provost, Yolanda Zepeda, popped in earlier, I'm not sure, but I know there's other leadership from the office present. I'm the Senior Director of Development for the office, so naturally, when I have a captive audience, I'm going to invite you to visit odi.osu.edu to learn more about the ways we strive to uplift inclusive excellence throughout Ohio State among students, faculty, staff, and in the community, and consider how you may wish to support those efforts. I will also bring you greetings on behalf of the Growing and Growth Collective, which was co-founded in partnership with many people who are in this room to encourage more Black, Indigenous, and people of color to engage with agriculture in their own yards, on their balconies, in community gardens, in local markets, or wherever they reside, but starting with the Near East Side of Columbus, Ohio. And you can follow GGC on Instagram, Facebook, and our Linktree landing page. I was asked to share a little personal context ahead of Dr. Myers' remarks to just kind of illuminate why her work is so meaningful personally to me and other works like it. Dr. Myers is a cultural anthropologist. She is a griot. She is a storyteller, a poet. She is a proverbial daughter of Zora Neale Hurston. Her work, her calls to action, are so important to me because it was the power of storytelling and recognition of my own lack of awareness of my family's oral history that brought me into my commitment to food sovereignty and land justice endeavors in my community life. So just a little quick backstory context. I've always felt like I've grown up in between two worlds. So I grew up in South Linden, which is directly on Jefferson Avenue, which is directly between the State Fairgrounds and Windsor Terrace, which I don't remember what it's called now, but that's what it was called back then, right? So two very distinct and different worlds, right? I grew up with my mom's side of the family being from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which it made news as being a city when it hit 50,000 people back in 19 whatever, and it's not that anymore. And Grandpa Jerry apparently was from Virginia and had turkeys running around in their yard, and he always maintained a garden, so I had that story. But then my cousins would come in from New York City in the summertime and come to the fair with us, and I remember sitting on the stoop, and they'd just be looking around, and they'd say, I remember them specifically saying, there are so many trees. And I was like, okay, like this, it just blew my mind, right? So I guess it was very different than Brooklyn, right? And so there's these two stories, but I never, even though they both have inherent connections to agriculture and environment, I never felt connected to environment or any aspect of agriculture or anything ever, right? And so when my father ended up passing, right before he passed in 2017, I started recognizing that at least at minimum, I didn't know anything about my family's history. So I started asking him questions. And I was always really perplexed. Like, I just couldn't understand why his response was consistently, I don't remember. He just wouldn't talk about it. And then I learned more about his generation being called the silent generation. But then I read The Warmth of Other Suns. So again, a storytelling piece that really it painted a picture as to why, and that's by Isabel Wilkerson. I think it should be required reading for everyone. Why I could understand why he possibly would intentionally forget, or at least not want to talk about it, right? So I did start getting some history from my paternal aunt, who I could understand why she had limited awareness of the family's story because they left Atmore, Alabama when she was 6. But in my mind, I had always just heard, oh yeah, they moved to New York. So I assumed that meant they literally decided they were going to move to New York like next week. Apparently, they left in 1948, and they were farmers in Atmore, Alabama. So my dad spent his whole life in an agrarian life. And then they didn't reach New York until 1950. They were migrant farmers for 2 years. And they moved from farm to farm to be able to afford to get to New York, and they still farmed when they got there. In Long Island, I had no idea. And so I asked my aunt if she still kept in touch with people from that time, because I was thinking, oh, maybe I can have conversations with them. Well, then she said, well, a lot of them passed away from cancers that they had never heard of, because she remembered being in the fields and they would spray pesticides over their heads while they're in the fields. So all of that to say, little seeds were planted along the way. But mind you, by this time, when I'm asking these questions, I had already worked in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences as a fundraiser for almost 3.5 years. So I'm literally surrounded by agriculture, but honestly, I never felt connected to it. I mean, I worked with wonderful people. I got to know a lot of people throughout the state. Everyone was very kind. But when you're in a room the size of Cardinal Hall on the state fairgrounds, hundreds upon hundreds of people there, and you can count on less than 10 fingers anyone who looks like you, you're just a guest, right? In a space that obviously is not meant for you, right? So that was what it came to. So all of these seeds came together, and it went from seeds to germination during the pandemic. Literally the day that we were all sent home, I took my son, stopped by the grocery store, because I didn't heed any of the calls to prepare in advance. I thought it was just going to be like, the hurricanes that don't manifest or something like that. And it actually did happen. And I walk in as a mostly vegetarian at the time, and the shelves were bare. So literally in that moment, everything came rushing at me at once. I'm walking through the store with my child with the recognition of, I'm quite literally a farmer's daughter, and I don't know how to feed myself. So I left, and luckily I knew Tim McDermott, and he had all the knowledge and skills. So I just was thirsty for more, and I wanted to know. I never wanted that to happen again. That was the main thought. I want to be able to feed myself if something goes down like this again. So fast forward, here I am, still thirsting for knowledge, but also with regard to the goal that we heard for racial healing, I'm also thirsting for trust, restoration, community, wholeness, for challenging, for rebuilding, and for a new social structure. And that's why we're here today. The goal of racial healing, as we heard, is to build trust and restore communities and people to wholeness while challenging and rebuilding social structures. So as you listen to Dr. Myers' remarks, I ask you to consider, is that what you're here to do? Like really here to do? Because it's really cute to come into a nice room with nice people, great food, and think you've done something. But I push back to you, and I ask you to push back. When you're faced with opportunities to speak up, I ask you to speak up. When you are in positions where you need to stand strong, I ask you to stand strong. Look around our world. Facts, land and environmentalism and challenges to it, fights over it. We're experiencing it here. It's happening everywhere. If you're quiet, you're not helping, okay? So we have to speak up, and we have to learn from the stories that are collected and shared. We have to share our own stories so that we are empowering one another to demonstrate who our community is, who will support us, and who we can come together with to be stronger together. So we bring up our Dr. Gail Myers. Her bio is in the packet here. There's plenty online. I won't belabor that, but that's just a little context for my own story. I ask you to think back on your own journeys, think about the people in your community, and how we can learn lessons from her remarks and then from the following commentary to empower ourselves to make a difference when it comes to land and stewardship in a sustainable way.
Greetings, everyone. Wow, listening to those remarks sounds like I'm about to solve world peace. That's a lot of pressure. No pressure. It's such an honor to be back on the land of Ohio, on the grounds of Ohio State, as I say, where it all started. It was in 1997 when I was here pursuing my PhD, first-year grad student, and did an interview with a black farmer. And as you can say, or as they say, the rest is history. I actually didn't come to the Ohio State University to stay in Ohio to interview farmers in Ohio. I was supposed to be in Ecuador, but upon interviewing my first historian and then a farmer, it was just blowing my mind, all the information that they shared. And more than that, I became aware of a group of people that had so much love and understanding of the nature of how our land works, how we feed ourselves, and how we're in community. And I thought, these people need to be sort of the exemplars for the world of what it's like to be in community. So 28 years later, I'm still talking to people about the importance of recognizing black farmers. So today, you know, some of you saw the film. Okay, thank you. So for the folks that came to the film, some of this will sound familiar, but I'm going to explore something new. And some of you may be familiar with some of this, but I want to start sort of, you know, broadly and sort of bring it into community here in the U.S. And I want to suggest that land has so much power, and it's so important for liberation. So land, for African Americans coming out of the Civil War, land was important for developing settlements. And actually before the end of the Civil War, some all-black towns had already been established, some in Ohio. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But it was the importance of having access to land, and you're able to develop a community. Now, in the peak year, 1920, there were at least 60 all-black towns. Oklahoma had 20, Ohio had 20, and many more before the Civil War. Today, there are only 13. Someone recently did some research and suggested that there were 1,800 all-black towns at one point, and 13 still remain. I've been to about half of those. Thank you. So, oh yeah, this is much better. And so the land for, you know, all practical purposes when we talk about community development and developing infrastructure, it was the collectivization strategies that African Americans developed that created schools, churches, loan, mutual aid societies. These aided in the survival and the continued growth and development of these communities. And so access to land facilitated the resistance, the isolation of that, usually, and I'll say about the Maroons, it was some isolation, but it was the resistance to this racialized violence that African Americans have been enduring since being in this land. And it is an ability to maintain foodways and collective identity. So who are the people, some of the people that were liberated on lands? Many of you, have you heard, how many people know about the Maroons? Quite a few, quite a few. Well, this is the point that really kind of brings home the importance of having land. Because a Maroon, a black person of the Americas who escaped slavery and or formed secluded settlements. In Brazil, these communities were called quilombos, and the people that were inhabiting these communities were called quilombolos. Towards the end of my presentation, I'll say a lot about the Gullah Geechee communities because these are current liberated enclaves that are still existing in the U.S. And they were able to exist because they had land, facilitated their independence. And so these early all-black settlements are forms of liberated spaces. And as we can see, they gain power, and that is why I say land is power. So the Maroon communities were examples of how enslaved black people achieved liberation. I mean, even if for a few decades or a few hundred years in some cases, by living on the land, they were able to maintain language, in particular now in the case of the Gullah Geechee community and their continued dialect, the same material culture, making baskets, making nets, spiritual and food ways. And so African people who liberated themselves because they were able to access land. Now, for the Maroon communities, the reason that they were able to develop and so have some sort of autonomy is because they were inaccessible, located in very deep swamps, very deep jungles. As a matter of fact, the community that I was going to go to Ecuador to study, the Shota people, were a Maroon community that had moved into the rainforest area, and eventually in about the 50s or 60s started coming into the community, and that's how a lot of people recognized that they were there. But Maroon communities were established in swamps, the Great Dismal Swamp, I'm not sure if any of you know about that, the mining canyons in Brazil, which I'll go right into in just a moment, and the Gullah Geechee corridor as a place for liberation and resistance. And that community is still there trying to hold on. As a matter of fact, my paternal side are Geechees. And it was a term growing up, it was very derogatory, there was a lot of shame, primarily because of the language, because of the dialect that we spoke. And, but there was a lot of respect as well, because I remember stories around my uncles saying, you know, they would say stuff about us, but no one would mess with us. So I don't know what that was about. But I didn't go into it. So in Brazil, in the Campo Grande, this was a community of runaways that were, for the Portuguese, took the African cargo into Brazil so they could dig for gold and search for diamonds in the mines. And so in the 1720s, the runaways from the Minas Gerais founded 3 concentrations of Colombo settlements in this Campo, I'll show you that slide in just a second. But they moved into the inaccessible mountain areas and were able to stay there for hundreds of years, actually. And I've been keeping up with the community, and just recently, about 400 people are still on that land, and the government is really evicting them, and they're going to develop it. But the Campo Grande was a cluster of about over 6,000 people for hundreds of years, and they were able to maintain their traditions, their food ways, and become independent landowners, or land occupiers in this case. And their traditions are a combination of African and Amerindian traditions. So this is the area, the yellow area is where Campo Grande, the Maroon or Quilombo community was. But again, that community is still there and it's been developed. But initially, when the Portuguese first went there, they weren't able to get into the deep areas in the forest, and so that's why the Quilombolas were able to live and survive. Another example from the U.S., the Great Dismal Swamp. Anybody familiar with the Great Dismal Swamp? It was right here in the U.S. There were people in Virginia and North Carolina. It was the British that went in and they wanted to log the swamp, and so they brought in enslaved labor to drain and log the swamp in the 18th and 19th centuries. But these people escaped, and they lived in freedom and to become Maroons, and thousands of people lived in the Great Dismal Swamp for almost 100 years. And this is an old shot of what that looked like. And again, they were able to maintain their sense of their independence because not many people could access that area. There was no, eventually though, the paramilitary came in, just like in Brazil, and displaced the Quilombolas, and same thing that happened in the Great Dismal Swamp. But we see that land is, for these particular instances, it's important because it facilitated hope, a place to grow and survive. a place that people could feel liberated on the land and they were not forced to work. They were able to maintain their values around compassion, community responsibility, and the evidence of work that they saw. The land was the resistance that spoke to sovereignty and a sense of freedom. When you're on your own land, you can keep your own name. Do y'all remember the root story in Kunta Kinte? And they kept saying, "You're Toby, you're Toby." And he kept saying, "Kunta Kinte." Well, eventually they beat it out of him. And his name, he submitted and he says, "Toby." But when you're on your own land, you name yourself. And so that is some power there. And you can reclaim your community power when you have land. So let's say a little bit about the Gullah Geechee community. The Gullah Geechee community, actually, many were in those isolated areas along the Gullah Geechee corridor around 1820. So this was prior to the Civil War, where people were able to dig out a canoe from one of the huge trees, and they were able to navigate the waters within the areas around South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and eventually to Florida. And so these isolated islands with little access other than bridges, or now they have bridges and ferries, but before then, they didn't have anything but the boats. And the history of South Carolina, when the enslaved, mostly the people from Senegambia were there, it was basically like a big, like the Dismal Swamp. There was nothing. It was uninhabitable, unnavigable, but it was the Africans that went through and created these waterways. And the waterways later on were able to be part of a preserve system. They were able to build out navigable pathways without destroying the land, without destroying so much of the nature, but they were able to live and survive. And so they were able to maintain their traditional foodways, the material culture, the dialect, this particular language, and spiritual practices. And so they were able to keep the praise house. And the other thing that really was significant about the language is that they were able to talk. There's a story, there's a Gullah Geechee griot, that they were able to talk about the white slave masters without them even knowing it, because they had a particular dialect and a particular language. So they're standing right there and talking about the Buckra, and that was the name that they had for the white slave master. The communities that were the Gullah Geechee members, unfortunately, what they're fighting about, and this is one of the reasons why I'm always mentioning it, is that their land is being taken over. The developers have come, the state agencies have come, and they've said, and this is land that's right on the water, right on the ocean, right on the rivers. So it's prime land, and so developers want it. And so this is the Gullah Geechee corridor from Jacksonville, North Carolina, all the way to Jacksonville, Florida. Covers 4 states. And within that corridor, as you can see, it's right on the coast. Thriving communities were there. Thriving black communities prior to the Civil War, post-Civil War, and most recently in the sort of the Charleston area, between Charleston and Savannah, is where there is still some land that's owned and still held by Gullah Geechee community members, but they're trying to take it. I don't know if you've heard of Harris Neck. Is a community that the land was given to the Gullah Geechee members, and then it was eventually taken by eminent domain. So, you know, there are several ways in which these communities continue to lose land. Some, you know, for farmers not getting loans, you know, white neighbors trying to come and take their land. But the other part is the development that is a part of building up so-called the community so that they can make a profit. And so we justify that because, hey, it's about money, making money, and not about keeping community. So this is where that Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor exists. This is a praise house. When I mentioned the spiritual practices. So, and I've actually been in this particular praise house in the area in Sea Island, South Carolina. The purpose of the praise house was, and it's similar to, I don't know if we have anthropologists, the Leopard King. You know, in the Leopard King, most communities had a traditional leader that was the person that sort of negotiated, for conflict resolution. So the praise houses are basically the structures where people go in, there's an elder in the community, and they bring a community problem. So they'll sit, it'll be the youth, if you got a problem with your neighbor. And so after the sort of the negotiation or the conversation, these houses are located in the woods, in the forest, because they want it to be away from the eye of folks that could come and probably destroy them. But once the actual conversations were taking place in the praise house, it was in the woods, and then right outside, people would pray. They would pray, they would sing, they would shout, and that was part of the tradition. But that prayer was done in the forest. It was done in nature. It was very important that it was a part of nature, because the African worldview is that we are extension of a part of nature, and so we've got to take care of it. And so there's really not a separation. But this praise house, these still are a few praise houses. This one is not active right now. I did a tour and we went in there. But there may be one or two praise houses in South Carolina in the Gullah Geechee community. But they've gone. They used to be in most every community, but they're not present anymore because they've lost that land. Some of you may have remembered this woman, Jera Taylor, from the film. She's a sixth-generation basket weaver, and she's the one in the film that tells the story about the rice and why Africans were captured and brought into the South Carolina. And at one point, South Carolina was covered with rice fields. South Carolina was one of the first states that created millionaires. There were so many white millionaires in South Carolina. There were white millionaires in Natchez, Mississippi from the cotton, but in South Carolina, it was the rice. And the rice basket, the fanner basket, was crucial to the rice industry, because the people, the Africans, we would, as in the film, they would winnow the rice, and the wind would blow the chaff off. And so that basket weaving, and so most plantations, if you didn't have a basket weaver on your plantation, some slave owners began purchase baskets from other plantations. But that is part of the rice community and the rice tradition. And so they knew how to, create these baskets. And initially when the basket weaving tradition was brought into this country, men were the basket makers. They were the weavers of the basket. But when the Civil War broke out, the women began to make the baskets. But it was a tradition really promoted by men. And if you're in parts of Africa today, you might see men weaving baskets. And so when you talk about resources and the material that they were using to make baskets, when you don't have your land, it's difficult to get the grasses and the other things that are made from the basket. And this slide basically talks about this couple carrying the sweetgrass, which is the basket that Jera Taylor, it was a sweetgrass basket. And she tells me the story that in the event that for some reason there is a shortage of the sweetgrass, they went to another grass called the bulrush. And she likes that because the bulrush grass is a little thicker, and so her baskets contain the bulrush and the sweet grass. But they're limited now in the resources to even make their baskets because they can't get onto the land. The land is being destroyed, and so they're not able to collect the particular grasses that they need. So there were some examples I want to share, just sort of go over again from the film. As the stories of in the interviews, the farmers mentioned their responsibility. Alvin Stepp mentions that if someone was sick, everybody in the community was supporting that family. And that's basically, that was sort of inherent in being a member of the community. You were responsible for everybody else in the community. And you take care of the land because it will take care of you. Dorothy Barker mentions that. It takes care of you because they were able to get medicines from the land, so the land heals. They knew where to go to get what they would call the yellow root. Anybody know about the yellow root? So yes, the yellow dot. And so if you knew that, where to get that, that was a healing. And people stayed in the South. They stayed on the land. The Great Migration that, of Black folks leaving the South did not happen after the Civil War. You would think that, wow, we're just going to run away, get away from this horrible conditions. But because that is what people knew, they wanted to stay on that land. Plus, there was a discussion that the land would be divided and it would be given to them. I mean, we had worked this land for hundreds of years. Why not be given some land? So people stayed there with the hope and the belief and the trust that that land would be divided. But it wasn't. There were a few, Sherman's order number 13 with the 40 acres and the mule. Very few people got that, but by and large, these Black folks that had worked this land were not able to get the land on the plantations as they had hoped. And so the agrarian values and the life ways were talked about. And that's, we talk about the foundation of the American, the U.S. value. It's the agrarian value. Do for self, do for others, take care of the land. And so those, when I mentioned that because the stories that are part of the documentary mention the agrarian values, even the community responsibility, that's a value. And there, in testimony after the Civil War, a lot of the politicians went south and they were having meetings and hearings and town hall meetings with the African Americans and wanted to know, what is it? How can we, what's the next step? And there's recorded of one man that said, give us some land and we'll take care of ourselves. And that was the idea, the sense of independence. They wanted land. They knew that land was power. So give us the access to land and leave us alone. And so the families, they raised everything that they needed off the land, the food, the clothing, made the blankets, the hunting, the traps, fishing nets, and continued to grow the traditional food ways. That's a part of liberation. Maintaining culture was tied to land, and that is what we see in the Gullah Geechee communities. The sense of power and autonomy, the power to heal from trauma. Someone asked me a question last night around, wasn't it traumatic coming out of the enslavement period, and how was it for people to handle the trauma? And I mentioned that there's healing in the land. My own personal experience, I mentioned this situation. But that's one of the things that healed. People were able to access the land. They were able to plant their dreams, plant their hopes. And because of that, they were able to resist the victimization narrative. And so that whole thing had a sense of safety, mentally and physically, because land was and land continues to be liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. We have plenty of time for questions, so please just raise your hand. I'll try to run the mic to you. We also have folks watching on YouTube, so we'll be taking those questions through the chat. So, any questions to start? Yeah, Ari.
Thank you. I can't help but recognize that the areas where many of these communities are also the most to be impacted by climate change now. And we are seeing that, especially on the southern coast here. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there are conversations in these communities about how they weather that and how they act on that global level, and not just protecting what is there, but now, and how they kind of look at that in the long term, because it's an existential threat that could not only wipe the history off, but force the relocation of many communities.
Absolutely. That actually is a concern in the Gullah Geechee community, and conversations with the queen of the Gullah Nation, because now the Gullah community has created their own nation so that they can seek sovereignty. And that is a big concern, because all of those communities are on the coast. And they are dealing with the changes of the climate and extreme weather conditions. And so they are adapting to that. One of the beautiful things about people who are on the land and they have evolved in knowledge with the land, they're able to adapt to the climate change in ways that folks that are foreign to it don't understand. So they're able to, for example, one of the things that I know in the Gullah Geechee community, if there is a waterway, for example, that's typically a fishing hole or a fishing spot, if there is a diminishing number of fish, and they can tell by the color of the water and a lot of other things that I can't tell, but they don't fish there. They will recreate and they will supply another area and that same area. So they're conscious of their impact on the environment, but they're also understanding that there's a lot of stuff that is beyond their control. So the best thing for in particular in the Gullah Geechee situation is for them to recognize the role that they play in, not aiding and not doing anything to continue to diminish the environment, but ways in which to incorporate their traditional practices, create new practices, and create new ways of farming and feeding communities that are they're being forced to, because not having access to land. So it is a consideration, it is a concern. It's a $20 million question at this point. What do we do about climate change? The most important thing is to not deny it, to be aware that it exists, and to be aware that there's a human hand in creating it. And so the best that we can do is acknowledge it and make plans to adjust and adapt to a changing climate.
Good morning. And
Good morning.
greetings in the spirit of sovereignty and freedom. I appreciate your
Yes.
presence, not just your message, but your presence in the shell that you've showed up. I appreciate you reflecting some of the greater aspects of who I am. My name is Sophia, and I had a question for you last night, and it was related to how many of the folks that you actually interviewed considered themselves indigenous to the land that they were in already. Like, how many people can tell the story of, I did not come here on a boat, but I was already here. And I potentially look like the people who were brought over on boats or up north or down the way. But for the most part, the people, in my understanding, that were indigenous to the lands often looked like each other, but very spread out. So my question to you, again, you did mention that it really didn't come up, but I think you answered it in the maroon concept. And that is because regardless of where you were from, and our relationship was freedom and sovereignty, you were welcomed. Absolutely. So like hearing that story kind of reminded me of where we are today, where we're so fixed on territory. And it is because, similar to what this gentleman asked here, talking about all the other things of why we want to be sovereign. And it's not weather patterns, it's other people, right? And so if we are trying to have some type of sovereignty as a collective, then we might not be identifying necessarily to where part of land was specific to us, but the land within itself, because she's the mother of all. So I did want to say to you that we did have a very long conversation at the Blackwell after watching the movie, because that was something that was really on my heart. So I guess I'll share it again if I was to ask you this question about the indigenous people and the Maroons. Was there anyone specifically saying, you know what, we kind of just already been here outside of what is so-called slavery?
And I didn't hear that particular statement, but there are many communities to a lesser degree, probably with the Gullah Geechee community, but a lot of black settlements, especially in Oklahoma, other places in the South where there were Native Indians or Native Americans in the community. As a matter of fact, and I didn't mention it, but Fort Mosey, it's a community outside of St. Augustine. That was actually in 1565, one of the earliest all-black communities. And again, the Africans that came in with the Spanish and developed their own communities. In that situation that came, there were mostly men, and so their wives that they took were a lot of time Native American women. So in those communities, there were a lot of mixed heritage, if you will, communities. And so, and then the people are the land. The people are tied to the land, the practices, the traditions. And so as the African communities began to develop settlements in those areas that were mostly isolated and combining efforts with the Native Americans, they became a part of that tradition. So a lot of traditional foods, even in the Gullah Geechee community, are a combination of the foodways of the African society and the foodways of the Native American society. But I will, look for that because it's a very important statement to hear from individuals. I will say from my own personal experience, my mom's side, my maternal side, my great-great-great-grandmother, I'm told, was a Cree Indian. So we went to Bainbridge, Georgia, I think I was about 8 or 9, to visit family. And at night, one of my great aunties, she had her hair tied up, but at night she pulled her hair down. It was a very long ponytail. And I remember going back home and I said, Mom, Auntie has very long hair. And so she said, yeah, we're Indian, but we can't talk about it. So there was a lot of shame. A part of the Trail of Tears, a lot of Africans didn't even talk about the Indian blood. And so there was a lot of silence there. And so I'm still not able to get much information from my side of the family, but I know that there were Native American, especially in Georgia, the Seminole areas, that just had to happen, right? Both communities were, victimized and tried to survive. And so the camaraderie-ness helped in many cases. I mean, certainly there were cases in which there were animosity and antagonisms and people didn't come together. But in a lot of cases there were. And I wish that there was not so much shame in this country around African roots and Native American roots because we'd have so much more information, right? We'd know more about those connections. But, it takes those of us that are researchers and interested, in the academy and outside of the academy to get in the field. That's how we get this stuff. We can't sit in the classroom with our armchair scientists. We got to get out there in the field and talk to people. And so that's how we find out. And then we write articles. And then another student that's coming up, and a freshman or a junior, it's like, I want to follow up on that. So then we build on that knowledge. But first, we need a place to hold that knowledge, and we need to collect it. But I'm very interested in following up on that. And thank you so much, Sophia, for bringing that to my attention.
Yes, dear beloved.
Jim.
Dear beloved, thank you for being here. We love you so much. I have a question about people here who are here from Ohio State and the community, what they can do. Before I get to that, let me just say that you have been on the case for so many years, and we appreciate that. And as other elders in our community, part of our role is to kind of like create some synergy. Now, here's the question that I have. I'm an old country boy from Kentucky. I was in my dog sled last night saying mush to get up here, to hear this dear sister. And she and I have different points of connection with her organization called Farms to Grow. Now, everyone here knows that there are still Maroons in our communities. Everybody here knows that we all have a responsibility to help liberate the existing Maroon zones. And their Maroons are in a variety of ways. They're in our communities, wherever we are. They're here on the campus. Gail and I were mostly Gail, I'm just a little old country boy, had a role out at Stanford in creating what's called the Black Farmer Toolkit as a way of liberating the Maroons. So if you wouldn't mind, Gail, describe that toolkit, but also in a way where because it's a national model for universities. Am I right?
Yes.
It's a national model for universities. It's a national model for the Urban League. It's a national model for governments. We all must leave here and do something to help liberate the zones. I'm going to be speaking here at the OFA conference in February. I'm going to do 2 talks at Ohio State as well. But help frame that toolkit
Okay.
and your work at Farms to Grow, that's been so fabulous, as a charge to every person in here to help liberate the existing Maroon zones. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Jim. I love and adore you as well. So we've been working, our organization in Oakland that I co-founded in 2004, we've been in partnership in some ways working with Stanford University, I guess for the last 8 years. They came to us because as far as California is concerned, Farms to Grow is the only group that's working with African American farmers statewide. And they wanted to up their commitment to Black farmers. So they came to us and they said, we'd like to purchase some food from you all. And we had to explain to them that Black farmers are not even at the starting line. We don't have the tools, by and large, to even compete. And that's one of the things that happened in the pandemic. So Stanford, when we begin to, continue to work with Stanford, and they said, well, we want to figure out how we can, do better. And we said, well, if you really want to invest, then you'll meet with us, and as you help us to develop our farmers' capacity to distribute food for you, we want you to invest financially. We want you to invest with your institutional leverage and your clout. And so we collaborated, we recruited our farmers, we sat down at the table with them to explain what it is they needed. So part of what happens, I'm not sure if you all are involved in any kind of commercial distribution in the institution, but you have to have your ag permit, right? You've got to have your food safety. You've got to have your food audit, which is generally $1,200. You have to have your area fenced if you're going to, grow food for commercial purposes. You have to have a whole plan on how you deal with sanitation, how you deal with waste. And so for a lot of Black farmers, they didn't have that. And so they worked with us. We developed this toolkit, and there's 2 parts of the toolkit. One is to empower farmers, and the other is to empower institutions, because institutions don't understand that Black farmers are not at the starting line and that they need this type of support. And so to commit to that kind of relationship, you have to be able to give stuff up front. And one of the things that we suggested is that when our farmer, we make a commitment, we sign a contract, there is a way in which you can do an advance so the farmers can pay for the labor. They can pay for some of the costs and the tools and things that they have to account, to expenses and stuff. And so their commitment was, we'll work with you. So it's a long-term relationship. And Jim, thank you for bringing that up. The toolkit it's not perfect. We've gone back with them, and we don't have a long enough time, but it was a challenge. I could do a whole workshop on the challenges of working with Stanford. they wanted to come in and take over. They wanted to say, no, we know what to do, and and the farm should grow, a way in which we, we're nice, and we're saying, no, go ahead and sit down. We're gonna work with you, but this is our lane. This is our work. We're going to show you how to work with us. And that's a challenge in many ways of working with institutions that have had all the power and all the prestige and all the money. They sometimes don't know how to take a back seat and sit down and listen to the people that have the knowledge that are bringing them stuff that they don't have. And so we've been able to really, work with Stanford. I commend them, for being able to sit there and listen to us, tell them, you all got it wrong this time. Bless your heart. But we need you all to get it right if you want to continue to work with us. And I think this is the kind of relationship, and these are the kinds of discussions that have to take place in institutions. But the role of Stanford is very important. They got all this money. They probably got I don't know how many $1 billion endowment. So it is their responsibility. If they want to live in a community and be in a state with, California's the ~1 ag state. There's something growing there 365 days a year. Our almond industry, I think, provides, 20, 30% of the almonds around the world. And so there's ag in California every day. And so if you want to, and we're out there in the field with our farmers every day. And so we want that commitment from an institution that has so much power, but we also want them to have, and I'm glad to hear, Doctor, about the culture of humility, because we need them to have some humility. And that's a lot of times what institutions don't have. They have a big boasting of this and a big boasting of that, but they don't have a lot of humility. And to work with people who don't have that kind of power, you've got to have some humility. And so the Stanford project, it's ongoing. You will be hearing about it, I think, 2024 as we kind of tweak the toolkit. The font was, it was not accessible to our farmers, basically. And so we need them to go back to the drawing board and make sure that we actually have a hard copy. When they were looking at being able to print it out, there was just too much space. It would have been a $100 document for a farmer to print. We thought farmers don't have a printer that they can print out all these color pages and one page for a picture and, all of that. No, let's go back. Maybe for the distributors who are part of food systems, they have a budget like that, so they can print, forever. But we needed to make it more accessible. And so we did the part that we did around language. We tested it. We did pilot tests with 10 of our Black farmers in California and around the country. So we know the language is right, the approach is right, but the way in which it was actually put on paper, presented, we need them to do better with that.
So we've had some great questions coming in on YouTube. I'm going to start with Annie Warmke's question. So Annie Warmke asks, as a landowner and farm owner, what is the most important way to support BIPOC, potentially farmers or homesteaders, BIPOC residents who want to get into farming or homesteading?
I would say give land. We need land. If you really want to put your money where your mouth is, give land. Vacant land, give land back. There is a situation that's going on in California with the, I don't want to even mess up the name, but it's a First Nations community that inhabited a lot of land in Oakland. And there was a community that had that land and they gave it back. They rematriated that land. So access to land, access to financial resources so that you can buy tools, tractors, seeds, equipment like that, and a representation within the political arena so that when these small communities have product that they need to sell, where are they going to sell it? Open up grocery stores. A lot of ag policies say you got to have this much, you got to have that much, so the requirements and the guidelines a lot of times prohibit people from competing and participating. So we need to make sure that our leaders are addressing the concerns of particular communities. There's no one size fits all. I mean, you got the big corporate farmer, you got the small farmer, and then you have the urban farmer. And so There are different, requirements, different sets of specifics within each community. And we need folks to recognize that an urban community may have different needs than a 500-acre farm, let's say out in a rural part of the community. But a recognition that BIPOC farmers have not had what we've needed historically and continue to not have it. So acknowledging that and making sure that there is sincere intention to make sure that these farmers and these BIPOC farmers and gardeners are able to keep their farm.
Thank you. Shima Roberts asks, might you know about how many Black independently owned farms there are currently, and perhaps the rate of closure and selling of those Black independently owned farms?
So nationwide, there are about 43,000. Correct me, Jim, is that about right? About 44,000 independently owned or part owners, Black farmers in the U.S. right now.
And any idea on the closure or selling rate? What's the second half of Shima's question?
Was the foreclosure? Oh, I don't have that rate.
Yes.
There's some anecdotal stuff, but I just last week, there was a young farmer that had taken upon himself to go in on his tractor and his horse and with other Black farmers and Black community members to talk about his farm that he been foreclosed on 2 years ago. And he's not in his 60s. Most of the average age of an African-American farmer is in the 60s. So this was a young person. And he was saying that, it's an injustice. So I don't know what the foreclosure rate, just to, sort of an anecdotal, for some reason, since Pickford, there are various entities within the Black farming community that has been trying to get loan data. We've been trying to get the USDA to tell us, and the farm loan agencies to tell us how many loans they've issued to Black farmers. They won't even tell us. There's some degree of secrecy on that. So it's anybody's guess. But that actually is a great research project for a student that may or may not be in this room. Develop something so we can address that. Go to the USDA. Find a relationship, find a partner, or find a back door, how to collect data, and find out how many loans they're giving it. There may be a way, of course, how you collect data. You may have to extrapolate it from something else, right? But it's not something that it's being shared widely with us. And to me, that's a problem, because it suggests that they're continuing to hide. They're continuing to not do the right thing, because if folks were doing the right thing, they would want to tell, look, this is what we're doing. We got all these new farms, and we done, extended $3.5 million in loans to farmers in Virginia. But we don't have that data, so I really, that's about the best answer I can give for that.
Hello.
Hello.
I want to give you a hug after this because you're amazing. So
I'll take it.
So my name is Nicole Jackson. I'm an alum of The Ohio State University School of Environment and Resources. My background is environmental education and interpretation, which is another field that's not quite as diverse. So I have a question in regards to what you were referencing in terms of just the collection of information. And I was thinking about this yesterday with the film, in particular with younger generations not being aware that they have access to land from family. And is there any kind of I don't know, I guess I don't want to use best practices, but in terms of examples, I guess, or even from the research you've done and the interviews you've done, around systems that have been created on how to better pass that information down, whether it's documented or by word of mouth, of, I guess, having access to land. So, grandparents, I have this land, I want to pass it on to my grandchildren. Is there an example of that? And if not, how can that be done or improved in terms of younger generations knowing and having that information that will be vital for future generations or just the legacy?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, over the last 20 years, organizations developed to protect land, legal organizations. I'm thinking of right now the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. It's a coalition of Black farming organizations and urban gardening organizations nationally that come together to do workshops. And so there is a model there to connect land that is underused with folks that want to get land, so National Black Food and Justice Alliance. There have been so heirs property, you all familiar with heirs property? A lot of families have land that was passed down to the heirs. And so with regard to heirs property, if it's, one family, and they have 2 kids, and then they have 3 kids, and then when they pass, and the land is passed to their 3 kids, so then it becomes, quite fragmented over time. And in order for folks to try to get a loan or try to develop the land, you have to get like one signature or everybody signs off on it. So it's always been a challenge to get families with heir property to improve their farm. Well, luckily, the last farm bill, they put in a provision to support heir property. So if your family has heir property, you can get some funding to develop legally, to figure out how to, get access to funding and develop the land. So there are various kinds of efforts that have, been developed, and I think more and more are being developed that provide instruction. And you may know about Leah Penniman's book, the Farming While Black. I believe she may have some references to organizations in there. But the wonderful thing that I've seen, I started this work in '97, and I think, on my hand, I can count the number at that time of Black organizations or entities that were really supporting increased access to land, Black farmers, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, a couple groups in North Carolina. But now, gosh, there's a plethora. And so that gives me very much hope that things will improve. However, we're still challenged with, there's so many distractions around, information. And I wish there was just sort of a 1-2 step where you can find the land, go fill out an application, and then get some funding to support it. And if you need training to know how to farm, get that too. But there's so many steps in between. And it does seem like there's a lot of, just distractions along the way. And so for people, especially, in Black communities that have land, trying to just live from day to day, the frustration of trying to make sure, we're able to pay the bills. And if there's get health insurance, one of the challenges for Black farmers, unless there's, a spouse that has a job or the farmer himself or herself has a full-time job to get insurance, they don't even have health care. So if you have a, problem, it might take you off the farm for a few days or a few weeks. And so that in and of itself is something you got to deal with, right? And so for communities that just have always had to endure something extra, it's just no easy pathway. But if folks that know people that have land in their family and they're not using it, maybe contact one of these organizations or individuals that that might, want to lease that land or maybe purchase an acre or 2. But there are all kinds of arrangements, and there are opportunities that are happening, not sort of in the large, but a few things that are happening around the country. There is hope.
Well, I don't want to detract from the message of hope. I think in the ending, I was thinking about last night where we had our conversation about, what's the one main takeaway as to how to protect, because I gather you said we need land, we need the money to develop that land and to develop skills. and we need representation in terms of opportunity, but we talked about representation in terms of protection as well. And talked about how the collective on our side of things in terms of being Black, Indigenous, people of color who are trying to pull together, but the protection piece of people who can speak up when they hear in back rooms, changes being made for whatever, reason, or can you just speak to like that protection piece and maybe how the collective adds to it and what allies can do to enhance that?
Absolutely. I mentioned that after going around the country and comparing the success rate of folks that are individual farmers and what it really takes now to be a successful farmer, in my opinion, it's challenging to have a land by yourself. It makes more sense to have a collective or cooperative or 2 or 3 farmers or, a group of maybe 5 or 6 to come together and collectivize knowledge, resources. The episode, the instance I mentioned was that, when you're growing food, you got to figure out how to sell it. Some people just want to grow. I just want to get on a tractor. I want to harvest it. I want to do this. I don't want to go to the market. I don't have a marketing plan. But when you're growing, and what's your marketing plan, right? And so when you have a group of people, someone may be good in marketing. Someone may be good in finance. Someone may be good in developing cooperative infrastructure. So you need all those entities and for the protection. Because oftentimes when, folks get land, Black folks in particular, there is a target on their back, a target on their land, especially if they're successful. We've seen that in California, farmers that have achieved, one of our farmers that worked with Stanford, his tractor, his truck, and trailer were stolen. To sort of sabotage his ability to be successful. I've heard so many instances of farmers' ponds being stolen, their animals being stolen. And so these are things that, in general, folks in the neighborhood who don't want to see a Black farmer succeed have gone about to make that kind of unfortunate decision to harm that farm. And so, the idea is that if we think about the next generation, we got to go together. There's the thing that says if you want to go far, you go. If you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. So we want to go far, right? It's going to be challenging to accumulate 16 million acres again and 218,000 independent Black farmers as there were in 1910. So that might never happen. But the entities, the farming communities that we have, could definitely be solid so that they are part of a continuing legacy so that in 100 years from now, we still have, the farm that Jera and Adrian started. We still have your kids and y'all's grandkids on that land, passing it on, using technology. One of the wonderful things I love that I've seen in this generation of farmers that are going back to the land, I've seen them have higher education. Mostly they have many have bachelor's degrees. Some have finance background. But they are coming with a lot more technical skills than the traditional farmer. And so that in and of itself could be an asset if we figure out how to incorporate that into, what are the needs and the demands of current time in the modern time. So able to access more information, able to do more marketing. There are all kinds of value-added products that can be developed. So in theory, there's a potential for more opportunities because of the skills that this generation is bringing. But again, we got to keep our land. We got to make sure that no one continues to try to do interference on our play to get to grow our land.
Thank you, Ms. Myers, for your response even to Ms. Jera's question and for the profound transference of what you've gleaned from your stories. I saw the premiere last night and the showing, And so I have a question, even
Yeah.
out of that. I'm Minister Aaron.
Hi, Minister
I am
Aaron.
a new beginning urban farmer, black urban farmer here on the South Side in Columbus. And I went away, after hearing the interviews and the powerful stories of the grandchildren, some of the grandfathers, and them telling their stories. Even the story that was really a great impact was the one about the youth that could not go to school and that they had to go to the field, and how their mother would put their clothes in their bag, and how they would change in the field and go off to school, but how their parents had to come back and bring them back. And so I was wondering that even as you did your interviews of these, and so a lot of them were in their 90s, and we saw some people 100 years old that were in there. Were there any youth that were in the room while their elders was telling that story? And was it a story that they already connected and could tell the story, even while grandma was up there telling the story, that they're nodding their head and they're touching and agreeing on that? And then also, even to the statement that you just said about that cooperative and us empowering that, that next generation, whose hands on the plow, who is the value-added food product producer in the family. And so were those youth in the room, and how receptive were they to the message of their, to their elders?
Well, they weren't in the room, but they were around on the land. And I'm thinking of the Barker family, where you saw the youth in the field. I was interviewing Philip in the field, and they were around, and they began to tell me about the students that were the A students. They would say, she's an A student. And so they, you could see that there was a sense of pride that they were wanting to share as being in that community. The story of the Rock family and Bailey Rock, I think she was 8 or 9 at the time. So I need to go back and see. So she's 18, 19 now. I wonder if she made it back to the farm. But youth are a part. If they're in their family, they are a part of doing the work. They're learning, not as far as doing the work from the production, but doing the work as far as learning. So Philip Barker had a summer program, and he was able to get stipends to pay the youth that were in the field. So they do have relationships, and making sure that the youth are a part of the conversations, and that they're incorporated. So these families are making sure that their next generation knows how to drive tractors. They know how to harvest. They know how to weigh the food. And so if you're part of a farming family, you got to work. You're not sitting playing Nintendo, all day, So, but thank you for your wonderful question. And the fact that I was able to go back and get the elders, that was so key, because I was looking last night at the credits and those that are in memoriam. If I had waited 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I wouldn't have. Mrs. Isafine actually lived to be 112. My great aunt, Aunt Rose, lived to be 103. So the women, they actually lived several years later, but Mr. Ephraim Lewis passed on. He was so critical. He actually was one of the earliest successful rice farmers in Arkansas. He went to, I think it was Gambia, because he was so successful. He was invited by the White House to go and help with the food production, but he tells the story of how frustrating it was, so he didn't stay, he came back. But these were very important people. You see, I interviewed Shirley Sherrard, Miss Shirley Sherrard. Very important people in these are our queens and kings, and, the shoulders that we stand on. And so it was so important that I was able to get there and interview the elders. So thank you for noticing that. All right, my time is up.
So thank you, Dr. Myers.
Okay.
So Joe asked me to reflect a little bit on what I may have gained sitting here today. And for those who know me, eloquence is not my strong suit. So I'll apologize in advance for the lack of eloquence in anything I say. But as I was sitting there, I was hearkening back to something that Jera, I had the opportunity to work with Jera for a couple of years, mostly during COVID, mostly by Zoom, while she was here in the college. And something that she said earlier really struck me, and that is, if you're silent, you're not helping. And that really struck me as I was listening to what Dr. Myers was saying, because really the first step in helping and breaking that silence is listening. And I'm not talking about listening so other voices are heard. It should be a foregone conclusion for all of us that all voices should be heard. But when I'm talking about individuals and institutions that need to be listening, they need to be listening for understanding. They need to be listening to the stories of the people who are living those stories, so that we can understand the context. We can understand how we can be a part of the change that needs to happen. And so I thank you for sharing all of your stories. I thank you for helping me to better understand. And hopefully we as individuals and institutions can use those stories to make the change that needs to happen. So thank you. As part of our EPN tradition, we want to recognize you with a certificate of appreciation. These are to acknowledge your work to help us learn and shape the world for the better. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Okay. Let me just say one other point. I'm glad you said what you said, Tim. And I want to challenge all of our allies in this room to not be silent, you know, and I know it's kind of tough because there's a lot of pressure to be status quo, but I challenge you to have our back. As we going into the room, you know, we can go in and enter, but we need you back there. And if we need to lean on somebody, we need you. So I ask, and I leave you with that charge. Thank you.
Please check out the details in the back of your program for upcoming EPN events. We return to in-person breakfast programming next month to focus on how advanced computer technology, AI, and satellite-driven remote sensing, as well as international collaborations, are enhancing the movement of migratory wildlife across North America's Rocky Mountains, from Yellowstone National Park to Canada's Yukon Territory. Room to Roam is a NASA-funded project designed to accelerate data analysis and coordination to improve wildlife management across borders. This program is led by representatives of 7 government agencies and conservation groups from First Nations, Canadian provinces and territories, and American states. It was launched from the community of Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory last year. And on February 13th, we'll be hosting the public and private entity-based experts coordinating this effort. Please reserve your spot for that program by signing up today, following the details listed on the screen. Our February breakfast will be followed by a 2-hour training session on the use of computer vision, camera traps, and animal identification, facilitated by an internationally renowned scientist from MIT, Dr. Sarah Beery, and an additional session on the use of citizen science data to survey bird migrations, led by Dr. Sarah Supp, a data analytics professor from Denison University. Then, right here on March 19th, we'll continue exploring international collaboration strategies for the environment, albeit much closer to home. Many of you know that Ohio's North Coast, Lake Erie, is part of a complex ecosystem of freshwater tributaries whose watersheds extend from American states, Canadian provinces, and North American First Nations. Our March event will bring together the national-level environmental management leaders of the Great Lakes to discuss invasive species, nutrient loadings, and harmful algal blooms emerging in forever chemicals, alongside strategies to enhance coastal resilience, fisheries health, and more. It'll highlight how agencies work with communities, regional academic institutions, and the private sector to improve restoration and resilience. These programs, like all EPN programs, will be live streamed for free via the EPN, via the EPN YouTube channel. Our March program will, similar to February, feature an extended 2-hour professional training for an in-person audience. So you don't miss out on upcoming details and opportunities, we encourage you to become an EPN member today through a free and easy process at epn.osu.edu. Once an EPN member, you can host post events, job openings, and receive announcements about forthcoming breakfast programs and other events happening in our region. If you haven't done so already, add your name to our list of over 2,300 EPN members to further connect, grow, and inspire with fellow environmental professionals and enthusiasts in the months ahead. Please check out the list of environmental professionals who have joined the EPN membership directory over the past 5 weeks. As Dr. Lechman introduced earlier, today is the 8th annual National Day of Racial Healing, which will feature several programs here in this venue in the hours ahead. Please review the itinerary in your program brochure, including our next activity, Identifying and Expanding Community and Market Relationships for BIPOC Farmers in Ohio. That will feature Patty Allen, Karima Samadi, Minister Aaron Hopkins, Nicole Wolcott, Celeste Treese, and concluding remarks by Dr. Myers. This program is open to all and will start again here in this room in about 10 minutes and will address topics of networking, education, fundraising, and aspects of the 2024 Farm Bill. While you're making your way out the door or clearing off your table, please help us return the reusable scarlet-colored plate and cutlery toolkits with all the pieces accounted for by scraping food off into the compost bin and returning these reusable dining materials to the bins located near the exits. If you're unsure of where to place your plates and utensils, and no worries, simply leave them at the table. We'll take care of the rest. Thank you for joining us and have a nice remainder of your morning.